Hi. So Donald Trump's ambassador to the United Nations, Elise Stefanik, said in her Senate confirmation testimony that she believes that Israel has a biblical right to the West Bank. Now, as a statement in American public discourse, this is an absurd statement, right? America should not be making public policy based on appeals to sacred texts that are sacred to some people, but not others, right? We have a framework of international law, which determines whether Israel has the right to control the West Bank. And also, we should be thinking in terms of basic questions of human rights and what it means for Israel to control that territory in terms of the rights of all of the people, most of whom are Palestinian who live in that area. But I also think it's worth noting that Stefanik's understanding of the Bible is, as I understand it, completely wrong from the perspective of Jewish tradition, which is to say the Jewish tradition, at least as I understand it, does not grant Jews unconditional political control over the West Bank or any other part of what we call Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And I think one of the writers who I've seen this make this point most clearly is Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, who's written this book called The Empty Wagon. It's quite a remarkable book, not an easy book. It's 1,400 pages, much of it kind of citing dense citations of Jewish texts and rabbinic authorities. But one of the points that Shapiro makes that I think is really significant is this distinction between the way Jewish tradition thinks about the holiness of the land and the question of political sovereignty over the land, certainly unconditional political sovereignty. So Shapiro writes, Eretz Yisrael is not a state at all. He's talking within the perspective of Jewish tradition. It is an area of land, its borders demarcated by the parameters of its holiness, not by political sovereignty. If the Romans own Eretz Yisrael, then one acquires the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael by moving to that part of the Roman Empire. Today, southern Lebanon is Eretz Yisrael. Someone living in some Arab town in southern Lebanon is thus basking in all the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, because he's making the point that the biblical borders of Eretz Israel are not the same as the borders of the contemporary state of Israel. His point is that the state has the land has a particular holiness because there are certain religious commandments, certain mitzvot that can only be performed in the land of Israel, especially agricultural mitzvot. And so anyone who's living in that land has access to a greater kind of holiness because there are commandments they can fulfill there that they can't fulfill somewhere else. But that's true if the land is controlled by the Romans or if it's in southern Lebanon. It doesn't matter whether there is a Jewish state there. Now, of course, the Bible does tell the story of Jewish kingdoms in part or all of the land of Israel, but then Shapiro also goes on to make the point that even according to Jewish tradition, when Jews do have sovereignty over all or part of this land, it's never unconditional. It's always conditional on whether they are fulfilling these obligations, right? And indeed, when they don't fulfill these obligations, the Bible repeatedly tells the story of Jews being exiled from the land. So he quotes the great 19th century German Orthodox rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch as saying, the gifts of a land and statehood are not an end in and of itself, but solely a means for carrying out the Torah. Whether or not Israel would possess and retain its land, therefore, depended on whether or not it would fulfill the demands of the Torah. And Shapiro also offers a couple of source citations from the book of Leviticus, one of which God says, the land belongs to me. You are strangers and settlers in it with me, right? That the only true unconditional owner of the land is God. And Jews have sovereignty over the land to the degree that they fulfill their obligations, right? And if not, they lose sovereignty over the land. He also quotes this famous line from Leviticus where God says, and do not let the land vomit you out for defiling it as it vomited out the nations that were before you. So the point is, first of all, that the holiness of land is separate from the question of political sovereignty, and that political sovereignty, to the extent that Jews have it or anybody else has it, again, in Jewish tradition, is conditional, not unconditional, right? With the ultimate owner being God, and God determining whether Jews or any other group of people have deserved the right to have that political sovereignty based on how they behave. And in the case of Jews, whether they're living up to Jewish religious commandments. Now, again, those religious commandments are complicated. Many of them might seem obscure, but surely, given the centrality of human dignity in Jewish tradition, one would have to think that the question of how you treat the dignity of the people in the land is one important condition in terms of your right to sovereignty, right? And this is what Stefanik, with her crudely racist view of Palestinians, and frankly, deep ignorance of Jewish tradition, completely misses, right? When she says that the Bible is basically a grant of unconditional political sovereignty over the land of Israel to Jews. It's an absurd argument in a secular political context and in a very dangerous one, but it's also an absurd argument in Jewish tradition, which I think is worth noting as well.